I think I found something so strange. It should have remained hidden. It started with a single piece of clay. Not a golden treasure, not a forgotten temple. Just a weathered clay prism covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks that almost nobody alive today can read without years of study. When archaeologists first uncovered it, they knew it was old, very old, but they had no idea that the words pressed into its surface would spark debates that are still going on more than a century later. The first time I read the English translation, I honestly thought there had to be a mistake. The very first king listed on the tablet supposedly ruled for 28,800 years. That couldn't be right. So I checked another translation, then I checked another. Still the same. The second king ruled even longer. The third, longer still. By the time I reached the eighth ruler, these ancient scribes claimed their kings had governed the world for more than 241,000 years before a catastrophic flood changed everything. That wasn't what I expected to find. And that was only the beginning. The deeper I dug into the Sumerians, the stranger the picture became. Every answer uncovered another question. Every excavation revealed another clue. Every translated tablet hinted at a civilization that seemed to appear almost out of nowhere, already building cities, developing writing, tracking the movements of the heavens, recording laws, and creating stories that would echo through history for thousands of years. If you've never heard of the Sumerians, don't worry, most people haven't. Yet almost everything we associate with civilization has roots that stretch back to them. They built some of the world's first cities. They developed one of humanity's earliest writing systems. They kept business records, wrote literature, recorded myths, studied mathematics, observed the stars, and created legal traditions long before many of the civilizations we learn about in school even existed. This all happened in southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now modern-day Iraq. It was a fertile landscape that allowed farming communities to grow into powerful city-states. Over time, names like Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur became centers of culture, commerce, and innovation. Archaeologists often describe this region as one of the cradles of civilization. That title is well-deserved. But here's what fascinates me. The Sumerians didn't just leave behind accounting records and shopping lists. They left behind stories. Stories about kings who ruled before a great flood. Stories about mysterious sages who taught humanity the skills needed to build civilization. Stories about divine beings, sacred knowledge, lost cities, and a world that seems strangely familiar if you've ever read the book of Genesis. Now, before we go any further, I want to make something very clear. This series isn't about proving extraordinary claims. It isn't about forcing ancient history to fit modern theories. And it isn't about telling you what to believe. There are enough channels doing that already. What interests me is something much simpler. What do the oldest surviving records actually say? What has archaeology actually uncovered? And why do these discoveries continue to capture people's imagination thousands of years after the last Sumerian city fell silent? Sometimes archaeology provides remarkably clear answers. Sometimes it creates even bigger questions. That's part of what makes this journey so interesting. Over the next several episodes, we're going to take our time and examine each clue in detail. We'll look at the original tablets whenever possible. We'll compare them with other ancient cultures. We'll separate established archaeological evidence from later interpretations. And whenever historians disagree, we'll explore why. But before we dive deeply into each subject, I want to show you the bigger picture. Think of this episode as our first walk through an ancient museum after everyone else has gone home. Imagine a long hallway lined with display cases. Inside each case rests an artifact that has challenged historians for generations. One contains a prism describing kings with impossible lifespans. Another preserves one of the oldest flood stories ever written. One speaks of 7 mysterious teachers who supposedly brought civilization to humanity. Another describes powers that governed everything from kingship to music. There's a missing city that archaeologists still haven't found. A king who is said to have journeyed into heaven and returned with forbidden knowledge. A civilization whose language seems to stand almost completely alone. And perhaps most remarkable of all, stories that refuse to disappear. Stories that resurfaced centuries later in Babylon, echoed through the Hebrew Bible, influenced Greek writers, and still spark debate today. Coincidence? Shared traditions? Fragments of forgotten history? We're not going to answer all of those questions tonight. That would take an entire season. Instead, tonight we're opening every display case just long enough to glimpse what's inside. Some of these clues have reasonable explanations. Some remain fiercely debated, and a few still leave archaeologists scratching their heads. So let's begin where many people first encounter the mysteries of ancient Sumer. Not in a temple, not in a palace, but on an ordinary-looking clay prism that quietly sat buried beneath the earth for thousands of years, waiting for someone to read it again. That single artifact has become known as the Sumerian King List. And hidden inside it is our first clue. If someone placed it on a table beside a golden crown or a jeweled sword, most people would probably walk right past it without giving it a second glance. It's made of clay, covered with rows of tiny wedge-shaped symbols that seem impossible to read unless you've spent years studying cuneiform. Yet that unassuming artifact may contain one of the strangest historical records ever discovered. Today it's known as the Weld-Blundell Prism, named after the man who donated it to the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford in the early 20th century. Standing only a few inches tall, it contains thousands of carefully pressed symbols arranged on four sides of the prism. Those symbols record a list of cities, dynasties, kings, and the length of their reigns. At first, everything seems perfectly ordinary. Kings ruled. Eventually they died. Another king took the throne. That's exactly what you would expect from an ancient royal record. Then something changes. The very first king isn't said to have ruled for 20 years, or 50, or even 100. According to the tablet, the first king, Alulim, ruled from the city of Eridu for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalar, ruled for 36,000 years. The numbers continue climbing until the first 8 kings are credited with ruling for a combined total of more than 241,000 years. The first time I saw those figures, my instinct was to dismiss them. Surely they had to represent something else. Maybe months. Maybe they were symbolic numbers connected to religious traditions. Historians have spent decades exploring those possibilities, and several interesting ideas have been proposed. Some researchers believe the enormous numbers symbolize prestige or divine authority rather than literal lifespans. Others have suggested they reflect mathematical systems built around the Sumerian base 60 numbering system. Those explanations are certainly possible, but here's the part that kept pulling me back to this tablet. The ancient scribes never paused to explain that the numbers were symbolic. They simply recorded them as historical fact. To the people who wrote this list, there doesn't appear to have been any distinction between impossible reigns and ordinary history. And then, something even stranger happens. Halfway through the king list, the pattern changes. A great flood is described as dividing history into 2 completely different ages. After the flood, the reigns begin shrinking. Thousands of years become hundreds. Hundreds eventually become decades. By the end of the list, many of the kings are people that archaeologists believe really existed. Their cities have been excavated. Their inscriptions have been found. Other ancient records mention them independently. Suddenly, the king list transforms from something that looks entirely mythical into something that overlaps with verifiable history. That transition is one of the reasons this artifact continues to fascinate researchers. If the later sections preserve genuine historical traditions, what should we make of the earlier sections? Where does mythology end? Where does remembered history begin? Or are we asking the wrong question entirely? Keep that thought in the back of your mind, because this pattern shows up again and again in ancient civilizations. The further back we look, the more history and mythology seem to blend together until separating them becomes almost impossible. There's another detail that's easy to miss. The king list doesn't begin by introducing a king. It begins by introducing an idea that would shape Sumerian civilization for thousands of years. It opens with a simple statement: after kingship descended from heaven. Just one sentence. But that single sentence changes everything. The Sumerians weren't claiming that people gradually formed governments through trial and error. They believed kingship itself arrived from somewhere beyond humanity. Whether that meant the gods, the heavens, or something else entirely depends on how the text is interpreted. Whatever they meant, they treated kingship as something that had been given, not invented. Imagine reading that sentence for the first time more than 100 years ago as scholars slowly translated these ancient symbols. You expect a list of rulers. Instead, the very foundation of civilization is described as a gift descending from heaven. That's not how most of us think history begins. And yet, this wasn't written by someone looking back thousands of years with modern ideas. This was written by people who lived closer to those traditions than we ever will. Whether they were preserving mythology, religious belief, or memories passed down through countless generations is still debated today. But one thing is certain, that opening sentence points us toward a place the Sumerians considered more important than anywhere else on Earth. A city they believed was the beginning of civilization itself. Its name was Eridu. If you visit the site, you'll find low mounds rising from the desert, broken walls, scattered bricks, and thousands of years of wind-blown dust. It's quiet now. Birds occasionally circle overhead, and the only sounds are the wind and the footsteps of archaeologists searching for another piece of the past. It's hard to imagine that this lonely place was once considered the center of the world. According to the Sumerians, Eridu wasn't simply their oldest city, it was the first city, the place where civilization began. When I first read that claim, I assumed it was another symbolic story. Ancient cultures often describe their own homeland as the center of everything, so I expected archaeology to tell a different story. Instead, archaeology made the story even more interesting. Excavations at Eridu uncovered layer after layer of settlement, each one built directly on top of the last. As archaeologists dug deeper, they discovered the remains of temples that had been rebuilt again and again over centuries, almost as if every generation believed this exact spot was too sacred to abandon. The deeper they dug, the older the city became. Eventually, they reached some of the earliest monumental religious structures ever found in southern Mesopotamia. No, archaeologists don't believe Eridu was literally the first city on Earth. Human settlements existed elsewhere before it. But Eridu is unquestionably one of the oldest cities ever discovered, and it played an enormous role in the birth of urban civilization. For a moment, imagine what that landscape might have looked like 6,000 years ago. The marshes stretched toward the Persian Gulf. Canals carried water into the surrounding fields. Fishing boats drifted quietly along the reeds. Smoke rose from mud brick homes while priests climbed temple stairways before sunrise. Long before the pyramids dominated Egypt's horizon, people here were already building organized communities, trading with distant regions, recording transactions, and creating religious traditions that would influence generations to come. That realization changed the way I looked at the ancient world. History often feels neat and organized when it's presented in textbooks. One civilization rises, another falls, and each chapter seems to begin exactly where the last one ended. Real history isn't like that. It's messy. Ideas overlap. Stories survive long after the people who first told them disappear. Sometimes one civilization quietly inherits the memories of another. The Sumerians believed Eridu was where organized civilization began. Whether they meant that literally or spiritually is something we'll probably never answer with complete certainty. But here's what's fascinating. Eridu isn't the only place where their stories and archaeology unexpectedly meet. Again and again, excavations have confirmed that many of the cities listed on the King List were real places. Kish, Nippur, Shuruppak, names that once seemed legendary, slowly emerged from beneath the desert as archaeologists uncovered streets, temples, inscriptions, and homes. One by one, the ancient cities stepped out of mythology and into history. That's when I started asking a different question. If the cities were real, if many of the later kings were real, if the scribes recorded genuine historical events alongside impossible ones, then how much of the older tradition might preserve memories of a world that existed before written history? Notice I'm not saying those impossible reigns actually happened. There's no archaeological evidence that anyone ruled for tens of thousands of years. But the people who copied these records clearly believed the earliest age of humanity was fundamentally different from their own. That idea appears in cultures all over the world. Long-lived ancestors, golden ages, great floods, civilizations destroyed and rebuilt, different names, different languages, yet strangely familiar themes. We'll come back to those comparisons throughout this series, because once you begin noticing them, they're surprisingly difficult to ignore. Now here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Imagine you've spent your entire life living in a farming village. Your family grows crops, builds simple homes, trades with neighboring communities. Generation after generation, life changes slowly. Then, almost overnight, in historical terms, everything transforms. Cities grow larger. Writing appears. Governments become more organized. Trade expands across enormous distances. Monumental temples rise above the landscape. Mathematics becomes increasingly sophisticated. Astronomers begin carefully tracking the movements of the moon and planets. The pace of change is astonishing. To us, this happened over many centuries. To archaeologists studying thousands of years of history, it looks remarkably sudden. The Sumerians had their own explanation for that transformation. They believed civilization wasn't discovered by accident. It was taught, and according to some of their oldest traditions, the teachers were ordinary people. One of the things that surprised me most about the Sumerians wasn't what they built, it was how they explained it. If you asked a modern archaeologist how civilization developed, you'd probably hear about agriculture, population growth, trade, and thousands of years of gradual progress. It's a picture built from excavations, radiocarbon dating, and decades of careful research. The Sumerians saw it differently. According to some of their oldest traditions, the skills that transformed humanity didn't simply appear because people became smarter over time. They were taught. Again and again, the ancient tablets describe knowledge being passed from divine beings to humanity. Not just religious beliefs, practical knowledge, how to build, how to govern, how to measure, how to write, how to organize society itself. At first, that sounds like mythology. After all, nearly every ancient culture credited its gods with teaching important skills. But then I started noticing something interesting. The Sumerians didn't describe civilization as one single invention. They described it almost like a collection of separate pieces that had to fit together before society could truly function. One of the oldest ideas connected to this is something called the me. It's a simple word, just 2 letters in English, but its meaning is surprisingly difficult to translate. Me weren't objects you could hold in your hand. They were more like the fundamental principles that made civilization possible. There was a me for kingship, a me for wisdom, a me for justice, writing, craftsmanship, priesthood, even truth itself. Imagine if someone handed humanity the instruction manual for civilization. That's the closest comparison I can think of. Without the me, the Sumerians believed society simply couldn't exist. It sounds strange to us, but think about it for a moment. Every civilization depends on invisible ideas, laws, language, rules, traditions, authority, money. None of those things physically exist, yet every one of them shapes our daily lives. The Sumerians imagined those concepts as gifts entrusted to humanity. And according to one of their most famous stories, they didn't remain in heaven forever. The god Enki, often associated with wisdom and fresh water, became one of the central figures in preserving and sharing this knowledge. One story tells how the goddess Inanna traveled to Enki's city. After a rather unusual banquet involving plenty of beer, Enki agreed to give her the May. By the next morning, he had changed his mind and tried to recover them. Too late, the gifts had already begun their journey toward humanity. It's a fascinating story. Part comedy, part mythology, part explanation for why civilization exists at all. Whether anyone believed it literally is impossible to know, but it reveals something important about the Sumerian way of thinking. Civilization wasn't accidental. It was precious, something worth protecting, something that could even be lost. That idea becomes even more interesting when another group enters the story. The tablets describe 7 extraordinary figures known as the Apkallu. If you've ever searched for ancient Mesopotamian art, you've probably seen them without realizing it. Some are shown wearing long robes, appear with the features of fish draped over their backs, almost like ceremonial garments. To modern eyes, they look mysterious. To the Sumerians, they were remembered as wise teachers. Each Apkallu was said to have brought knowledge that helped transform human society. Agriculture, architecture, writing, religious ceremonies, construction, law, the practical skills needed to build cities and organize communities. The first time I came across the Apkallu, I immediately thought of something that appears in cultures around the world. Stories of culture heroes, wise teachers who arrive after a chaotic age and show humanity how to build a better future. The Egyptians had similar traditions. The Greeks told stories about gifted lawgivers and founders. Across the Americas, there are legends of civilizing figures arriving from distant places to teach knowledge before disappearing again. Different cultures, different names, yet somehow familiar patterns. I'm not suggesting they all describe the same historical event, far from it, but I do find it fascinating that civilizations separated by oceans often remembered their beginnings in remarkably similar ways. The Sumerians never claimed they invented civilization entirely on their own. Instead, they remembered receiving it. And that raises another question. If civilization itself was considered a gift, who, according to the Sumerians, gave that gift? That question leads us to perhaps the most misunderstood figures in all of ancient Mesopotamian history, a group whose name has become surrounded by modern speculation, internet theories, and endless debate: the Anunnaki. Long before documentaries, novels, and television programs transformed them into something almost unrecognizable, the Anunnaki already occupied an important place in the oldest surviving literature on Earth. To understand why they're so controversial today, we first need to understand who the ancient Sumerians believed they really were. If you've spent any time watching documentaries or searching online, you've probably heard the name Anunnaki. For some people, the word immediately brings to mind ancient astronauts, visitors from distant worlds, or advanced civilizations that somehow shaped human history. Those ideas have become so widespread that they've almost overshadowed what the ancient tablets actually say. So I decided to go back to the beginning. Not to modern books, not to television shows, to the tablets themselves. The first thing I discovered was that the Anunnaki were never described as space travelers. The Sumerians understood them as powerful divine beings connected to the structure of the universe, the authority of kings, and the ordering of civilization. They weren't superheroes flying through the skies, nor were they mysterious scientists secretly building cities. They were part of the Sumerian understanding of how the world worked. Some were associated with the heavens, others with the earth, others ruled over the underworld. Each had responsibilities, personalities, rivalry, and relationships that unfolded across hundreds of myths. In many ways, they resemble the gods of ancient Greece far more than the characters often portrayed in modern documentaries. And yet, I can understand why the Anunnaki continue to fascinate people. The Sumerians described them as beings capable of making decisions that affected all of humanity. Kings ruled because the gods allowed it. Flourished because the gods protected them. Floods came because the gods decided they should. Whether viewed as literal beings or symbolic representations of natural forces, the Anunnaki occupied the highest level of authority in the Sumerian universe. One story in particular caught my attention. The gods gathered together, not to celebrate, not to reward humanity, to debate humanity's future. The ancient texts describe discussions about whether mankind had become too numerous, too noisy, or too disruptive. Eventually, a decision is reached. That decision sets in motion one of the oldest stories ever written, a flood unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. Now, if that sounds familiar, you're not imagining it. Most people know the biblical story of Noah. But centuries before the book of Genesis reached its final form, Mesopotamian scribes were already recording remarkably similar accounts. In the Sumerian version, the central figure is a man named Ziusudra, Later Akkadian versions introduce names like Atrahasis and Utnapishtim. Different names, different details, but the heart of the story remains strikingly familiar. A warning, a great vessel, a catastrophic flood, the preservation of life, the survival of one righteous man. The first time I compared these stories side by side, I wasn't looking for proof that one copied the other. History is rarely that simple. What fascinated me was something else. Why do flood traditions appear almost everywhere? Ancient Mesopotamia, the Hebrew Bible, ancient Greece, India, China, indigenous cultures throughout North and South America. Even remote island communities preserve stories of overwhelming floods that reshaped the world. Were they all remembering the same event? Probably not in exactly the same way. Large floods have happened throughout human history, and communities often preserve memories of disasters through storytelling. But when the oldest known written flood story comes from Sumer, it naturally raises questions about how later traditions may have been influenced. The Sumerian account begins with humanity thriving across the land. Cities grow, people multiply, life flourishes. Then the decision is made. The flood is coming. One man receives advance warning. Build a vessel, protect life, survive what is about to happen. Thousands of years later, those same themes still resonate. Whether someone approaches the story from archaeology, religion, literature, or mythology, it's impossible to deny its influence. And here's something I didn't appreciate until I started reading more of these ancient texts. The flood isn't treated as the end of the story. It's treated as the dividing line between two completely different worlds. Remember the King List? The impossible rains all appeared before the flood. Afterward, human lifespans begin shrinking. Kings rule for shorter periods. History becomes increasingly recognizable. It's almost as though the Sumerians believed the flood separated an earlier age from the world they knew. Keep that idea in mind, because another story from these same tablets explores a question that humanity has been asking ever since. What if death was never supposed to be part of the human experience? According to one remarkable tradition, there was once a man wise enough to stand before the gods themselves, and a single decision he made may have changed the fate of every person who came after him. Adapa isn't nearly as famous as Gilgamesh or Noah. In fact, unless you've spent time reading ancient Mesopotamian literature, you've probably never heard his name. That's a shame, because his story asks one of the oldest and most fascinating questions humanity has ever imagined. What if people were once given the chance to live forever and turned it down? According to the tablets, Adapa wasn't an ordinary man. He was exceptionally wise, and that wisdom came from Enki, the god associated with knowledge, craftsmanship, and fresh water. The texts describe Adapa as someone who understood things that other people simply didn't. He advised kings, performed sacred duties, and possessed insight that set him apart from everyone around him. One day, while fishing in the Persian Gulf, the south wind overturned his boat. Frustrated and angry, Adapa did something extraordinary. He cursed the wind. Not only did he curse it, according to the story, he broke its wing. For 7 days, the south wind stopped blowing. Imagine being the people around him. One of the forces of nature had suddenly fallen silent. The gods noticed. Adapa was summoned to appear before Anu, the supreme god of heaven. Before leaving, Enki gave him very specific instructions. You will be offered food. Don't eat it. You will be offered water. Don't drink it. Adapa obeyed. Standing before Anu himself, he refused both. Only afterward did he discover what had actually been offered. It wasn't ordinary food. It wasn't ordinary water. It was the food of life, the water of life. According to the story, Adapa had unknowingly rejected immortality. Whether Enki was protecting him or deceiving him has been debated for generations. The tablets never give us a simple answer. That's one of the reasons I like this story so much. It doesn't tell us exactly what to think. It simply presents the event and leaves us wondering. The similarities with later traditions are difficult to ignore. In Genesis, Adam and Eve lose access to the tree of life. Humanity becomes mortal. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, eternal life slips away at the last possible moment. In the Adapa story, immortality is offered and refused. 3 different stories, 3 different cultures. Yet each wrestles with exactly the same question. Why do humans die? It's one of those moments where you realize that people living 5,000 years ago weren't so different from us after all. They wondered about death. They wondered about meaning. They wondered whether things could have turned out differently. And they wrote those questions into stories that somehow survived thousands of years. That realization stayed with me long after I finished reading the tablets. The people who wrote these stories laughed, worked, raised families, argued, dreamed, and wondered about exactly the same things we still wonder about today. Perhaps that's why their literature feels surprisingly modern, despite its age. But if there's one story that truly captures the imagination, it's the tale of a king who refused to accept death. A king whose name has survived longer than almost any other from the ancient world. Gilgamesh. Most people have heard the name. Far fewer know the story. The Epic of Gilgamesh is widely considered the oldest great work of literature ever discovered. Long before Homer's Odyssey, long before Virgil, long before Shakespeare. Someone pressed this story into clay, one careful wedge at a time. At first, Gilgamesh is not a hero anyone would admire. He's powerful, arrogant, often cruel. His own people pray for relief from his rule. Their answer comes in the form of Enkidu, a wild man created to challenge the king. The two meet. They fight. Instead, something unexpected happens. They become inseparable friends. Together they accomplish impossible feats. They journey into the cedar forest, defeat the guardian Humbaba, challenge the bull of heaven itself. For a while, it feels like an adventure. Then everything changes. Enkidu dies. For the first time in his life, Gilgamesh realizes that no amount of strength or power can protect him from death. That fear consumes him. He leaves his kingdom behind and begins searching for the only person believed to have escaped mortality, the survivor of the Great Flood. The journey takes him across mountains, through darkness, and over the waters of death, until he finally reaches Utnapishtim, who tells him the ancient story of the flood. The same flood, the same dividing line between two ages that we've already encountered. By now, I was beginning to notice something. These weren't isolated stories. They kept connecting. The King List, the flood, Adapa, Gilgamesh, each one was adding another piece to the same enormous puzzle. And the deeper I looked, the more it felt like the ancient scribes weren't simply recording individual myths. They were preserving an entire worldview, a way of understanding humanity's place in the universe, one where the heavens, the earth, kings, floods, wisdom, and civilization were all woven together into a single story. And believe it or not, we've only explored half of it, because the next clues don't ask how civilization began. They ask how the Sumerians understood the heavens themselves. And that's where this journey starts becoming even more extraordinary. For thousands of years, people looked up at the night sky and saw more than stars. They saw stories. They saw warnings. They saw the movements of gods. If you've ever stood outside on a clear night, far away from city lights, you've probably experienced that same feeling. The stars seem endless. The moon rises with remarkable precision. The planets wander slowly across the sky, following paths that appear almost deliberate. Now imagine trying to understand that sky 5,000 years ago. No telescopes, no satellite, no modern astronomy, just generations of careful observation, night after night, year after year, century after century. The Sumerians watched the heavens with extraordinary dedication. They recorded the phases of the moon, recognized the predictable movements of planets, and developed calendars that helped determine when to plant crops, hold religious festivals, and organize the daily life of their cities. To us, astronomy is science. To them, it was much more than that. The sky was woven into every part of life. The heavens reflected order. If the heavens were orderly, then a kingdom should be orderly. If unusual events appeared in the sky, perhaps they meant something important was about to happen below. Kings consulted priests. Priests studied the heavens. Observations became records. Records became traditions. Those traditions would eventually influence Babylonian astronomy, which later influenced Greek astronomy, and from there, much of the astronomical knowledge that shaped the ancient world. That's one of the things I find remarkable about studying Sumer. The deeper you dig, the more you realize that many things we take for granted didn't suddenly appear somewhere else. Their roots often disappear into the cities of ancient Mesopotamia. But among all the people connected with the heavens, one man stands apart from the rest. His name doesn't appear nearly as often as Gilgamesh, yet his story may have influenced one of the most famous figures in the Bible. His name was Enmedaranki. Sometimes you'll also see his name written as Enmendarana. According to ancient tradition, he wasn't simply a king. He became something much more. The tablets describe him as a ruler whom the gods chose to bring into their presence. There they revealed knowledge that ordinary humans were never supposed to possess: astronomy, mathematics, divination, sacred rituals, the mysteries of heaven and earth. Imagine reading that for the first time. A king taken into heaven, taught secret knowledge, then returned to humanity to pass that knowledge to future generations. Sound familiar? If you've ever read the biblical story of Enoch, you probably noticed the similarities immediately. Enoch also walks with God. He is taken into heaven. He receives extraordinary knowledge. Later traditions describe him returning with wisdom about the heavens, calendars, and divine mysteries. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean one story copied the other. History is rarely that straightforward. But scholars have long recognized that many ideas from Mesopotamia found their way into later cultures as civilizations interacted, traded, conquered one another, and exchanged stories over centuries. Whether the account of Enmedaranki directly influenced later traditions is still debated. What isn't debated is that these stories share remarkable themes. Again and again, we find individuals chosen to receive knowledge from above. It's another pattern that keeps appearing, another clue, another thread connecting civilizations separated by hundreds or even thousands of years. And while archaeologists have uncovered many of the cities described in these ancient texts, not every clue has been found. One city continues to hide from us. The King List mentions it. Ancient scribes recorded it. Its rulers supposedly governed before the Great Flood. Yet, despite generations of archaeological exploration, no one knows exactly where it was. The city's name is Larak. Unlike Eridu or Uruk, no one can point to its ruins with complete confidence. No great temples have emerged from the sand, bearing its unmistakable name. No streets have been mapped. No palace has been identified beyond dispute. It's simply missing. That fascinates me. We sometimes imagine archaeology as a completed puzzle, as though every important ancient city has already been discovered. Nothing could be further from the truth. Entire settlements remain buried beneath deserts. Others lie beneath modern cities. Some have been washed away by rivers that changed course thousands of years ago. Others may never be found at all. Larak reminds us that history still contains blank spaces. There are places we know existed because ancient people wrote about them, but knowing a place existed and finding it are two very different things. Every few years, another remarkable discovery emerges from the deserts of Iraq. A forgotten temple, a royal inscription, a cache of tablets. Each discovery changes our understanding of the ancient world, sometimes in surprisingly dramatic ways. That means somewhere beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, there may still be cities, libraries, and temples that nobody has seen since antiquity. Imagine that for a moment. Words written 5,000 years ago, still waiting for someone to uncover them, still waiting for someone to read them again. That possibility is one of the reasons archaeology never stops being exciting. Every excavation has the potential to rewrite a small part of history. And speaking of unanswered questions, perhaps the biggest mystery isn't hidden beneath the sand at all. It's hidden within the people themselves. Who were the Sumerians? Where did they come from? And why does their language remain one of the greatest puzzles in the ancient world? The Sumerians left us thousands of clay tablets. They wrote about kings, merchants, priests, builders, farmers, astronomers, and ordinary people going about their daily lives. They recorded business contracts, marriage agreements, exercises, legal disputes, and poetry. The more I read, the more they stopped feeling like some mysterious civilization from another world. They felt human. And yet one question has refused to go away. Where did they come from? At first, that might seem like an easy question to answer. Surely archaeologists know where the world's first civilization began. The answer is yes and no. We know where the Sumerians lived, we know what they built, we know roughly when their cities flourished, but their deeper origins remain surprisingly difficult to trace. One of the biggest clues comes from their language. Unlike Egyptian, unlike Akkadian, unlike Hebrew, unlike Arabic, Sumerian doesn't fit neatly into any major known language family. As far as linguists can tell, it appears to stand almost completely on its own. Languages are a little like families. Most have recognizable relatives. English is related to German, Dutch, Swedish, and many other Indo-European languages. Spanish, French, and Italian share obvious similarities because they all developed from Latin. Even languages separated by thousands of years often preserve clues pointing toward common ancestors. Sumerian doesn't cooperate. It behaves almost like the last surviving member of a family whose relatives disappeared long before history was written down. That doesn't make it impossible to understand. Thousands of tablets have been translated. Its grammar is well studied. Its vocabulary is remarkably well known. But its ancestry remains uncertain. For me, that's one of the most intriguing parts of the story. Imagine discovering an old family photograph with only one person still alive. You know who they are, you know where they lived, you know what they accomplished, but everyone else connected to that family has vanished. That's a little like studying Sumerian. The civilization stands clearly before us. Its deeper roots remain hidden. Of course, archaeology continues to uncover new evidence every year. Researchers believe the Sumerians developed from earlier farming communities that gradually grew into increasingly complex societies across southern Mesopotamia. Nothing suggests they suddenly appeared overnight. Civilizations almost never do, but from a historical perspective, the pace of change was extraordinary. Within a relatively short span of time, villages became cities, temples became administrative centers, writing appeared, trade expanded across hundreds of miles, organized governments emerged. It's one of those moments in history where everything seems to accelerate. The Sumerians themselves explain that transformation differently. They believed civilization had been guided, ordered, taught. Whether those stories reflected religious belief, symbolic traditions, or distant cultural memories is still open to discussion, but they clearly believed their civilization had a purpose. That idea stayed with me as I finished reading more and more of their literature. They weren't simply writing myths to entertain people. They were explaining who they believed they were, where they came from, why kings ruled, why cities existed, why floods happened, why people died, why civilization mattered. In many ways, they were asking exactly the same questions we still ask today. Perhaps that's why their stories continue to survive. Not because every detail is historically accurate, but because the questions themselves never become old. And then I noticed something that completely changed how I looked at ancient history. The further I followed Sumerian ideas through time, the more often I encountered them somewhere else. The flood story appears again in Babylon. Later, similar themes appear in Genesis: a paradise garden, a tree associated with life, humanity losing immortality, a righteous survivor of a great flood, a man taken into heaven and given divine knowledge, kings chosen by heaven, sacred mountains, divine councils. Again and again, familiar ideas reappear in different civilizations. Sometimes they're almost identical. Other times they've changed enough to become entirely new stories. That's exactly what we would expect if ideas traveled alongside merchants, priests, refugees, and conquering armies over thousands of years. Stories evolve, names change, cultures adapt old traditions into new ones. None of that diminishes the importance of the original texts. If anything, it makes them even more valuable, because every time we discover one of those connections, we're looking at another thread woven into humanity's shared memory. It's easy to think of ancient civilizations as isolated worlds separated by enormous distances. The reality was much more connected. People traded, migrated, married into neighboring cultures, shared languages, borrowed technologies, and carried stories with them. Those stories changed as they traveled, but traces of their earliest forms often remained. That's one of the reasons the Sumerians still matter today. Not because they answered every question, but because they asked so many of them first. When you begin following those questions, you realize something remarkable. The influence of this civilization didn't disappear when its cities declined. It spread, quietly, patiently, across centuries, across kingdoms, across empires, until echoes of ancient Sumer could be heard almost everywhere the foundations of later civilizations were being laid. And maybe, just maybe, that's the greatest clue they left behind. When I first started reading about the Sumerians, I thought I was going to learn about an ancient civilization. What I didn't expect was to discover how much of our own story begins with them. The world's oldest known written epic. Some of the earliest surviving laws. The first recorded schools. The oldest named author in history. Detailed astronomical observations. Cities built around organized government. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets that somehow survived floods, invasions, earthquakes, and the rise and fall of entire empires. It's almost unbelievable when you stop and think about it. 5,000 years separate us from the first Sumerian scribes. The Roman Empire was still thousands of years in the future. The Great Wall of China didn't exist. The Parthenon hadn't been imagined. Even many of the civilizations we think of as ancient hadn't yet appeared. Someone sat quietly beside a lump of wet clay, carefully pressed one tiny wedge-shaped mark after another, finished their work, placed the tablet in the sun to dry, then walked away. They couldn't have imagined that thousands of years later, people on the other side of the planet would still be reading their words. In many ways, that's the greatest miracle of all. Not impossible kings, not mysterious gods, not ancient floods, writing itself. The ability for one human being to speak directly to another across 5,000 years. That's extraordinary. Throughout this episode, we've opened 15 different doors. Behind one, we found kings whose reigns stretched beyond imagination. Behind another, we found stories of civilization descending from heaven. We visited Eridu, the city the Sumerians believed came first. We met the Apkallu, the mysterious teachers remembered for bringing knowledge to humanity. We explored the Anunnaki as the ancient tablets actually describe them, separating the oldest texts from the modern theories that have grown around them. We followed the story of a flood that predates the book of Genesis. We stood beside Adapa as he unknowingly turned away immortality. We traveled with Gilgamesh as he searched for a way to escape death. We looked toward the heavens with Enmedaranki. We searched for a city that archaeology has yet to recover. We asked where the Sumerians themselves came from. And finally, we followed the trail of their ideas into later civilizations, where echoes of their stories continue to appear thousands of years after the last Sumerian kingdom disappeared. Notice something about those 15 clues. None of them, by themselves, prove anything extraordinary. That's important. History rarely works that way. Real archaeology is built one discovery at a time. One inscription, one broken tablet, one buried wall, one translated line. Piece by piece, researchers slowly assemble a picture of the past. Sometimes that picture becomes clearer. Sometimes a new discovery forces them to start over. That's what makes archaeology one of the most exciting fields in history. Every excavation has the potential to answer a question that's been asked for generations, or create 10 new ones. And that's exactly what happened to me while researching this series. I started looking for answers. Instead, I found better questions. Questions like, why did the Sumerians divide history into a world before the flood and a world after it? Why were their earliest kings described so differently from later rulers? Why did so many later civilizations preserve versions of the same stories? How much was mythology? How much reflected genuine history? And how much represented something in between? Those are questions worth asking. Not because they'll necessarily overturn everything we know, but because asking good questions is how we learn. As we continue through this series, we're going to slow down and investigate each of these clues properly. We'll examine the original tablets. We'll look at the archaeology. We'll compare translations. We'll explore what historians agree on, where they disagree, and why some debates continue to this day. Some episodes may leave us with satisfying answers. Others may leave us more puzzled than when we started. I'm perfectly comfortable with that. History doesn't owe us certainty. Sometimes the most honest answer is simply, we don't know yet. And perhaps that's what keeps drawing people back to ancient Sumer. It's familiar enough to recognize ourselves, yet distant enough to remind us how much we've forgotten. Somewhere beneath the deserts of Iraq, countless tablets are almost certainly still waiting to be discovered. Some may contain ordinary business records. Others may preserve stories nobody has heard for 5,000 years. The next great discovery could already be buried beneath a few feet of sand, waiting patiently, just as the King List waited, just as Gilgamesh waited, just as all of these ancient voices waited for someone to uncover them once again. Our journey is only beginning. In the next episode, we'll return to the artifact that started all of this. We'll examine the Sumerian King List line by line, explore why its impossible numbers have puzzled historians for generations, and ask one simple question. What were the ancient scribes trying to tell us? Keep asking questions. Keep looking beneath the surface, because sometimes the oldest stories still have something new to say. And maybe we'll never really know.